November 18, 1942, above Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The air stank of fuel and sweat, radios crackled with clipped Japanese words, and the Zero pilots prepared for yet another easy victory. But then, out of the glare of the sun, appeared strange, twin-tailed fighters, unlike anything they had ever seen. They did not turn, they did not duel. They climbed higher, flew faster, and struck with guns so concentrated that a single burst could rip a Zero apart. The paradox was devastating. The hunter had become the hunted. For the first time, Japanese pilots discovered there was no escape. They could not outclimb. They could not outrun. What happened next would change the Pacific Air War forever. Stay with us as we uncover the full story. And if you love these forgotten World War II stories, make sure to subscribe, like and support the channel so we can keep bringing history back to life. November 18th, 1942. Henderson Field on Guadalcanal was already a place where men lived half in daylight and half in fear. The smell of burned rubber clung to the runways, and the jungle steamed after morning rain. Overhead, a formation of Japanese Zeros glinted in the sharp sun, slim, confident, seemingly invincible. For months, their speed and agility had ruled the Pacific skies. But on this day, they met something they could neither outclimb nor outrun: Lockheed's P-38 Lightning. The paradox was cruel. Japanese pilots had been trained to expect that no Western fighter could match the Zero's turn radius or initial climb. Yet in the battle above Guadalcanal, they found the truth reversed. The P-38, with its twin engines screaming and turbochargers howling, surged upward and left the Zeros behind. A Japanese pilot later recorded in his log, bewildered, "They came from above and did not turn to fight. They simply struck and were gone." The encounter was more than a skirmish. It was the first major test of the P-38 in the Pacific, flown by the 339th Fighter Squadron. That morning, American pilots claimed 3 Japanese aircraft destroyed. The number might seem modest compared to the massive battles that followed, but in the air war's delicate balance, it was a thunderclap. The men who had ruled the skies suddenly found themselves outperformed in their own domain. Sound was the most haunting detail. Witnesses described the distinct roar of the Allison V1710 engines, deeper and rougher than the smoother whine of the Zeros. The Lightning's turbochargers produced a metallic shriek, a sound utterly alien to Japanese ears. It was more than machinery. It was a warning bell that technology was about to overtake tradition. The sensory shock was matched by tactical shock. Zeros dove after the American planes, only to find themselves left behind. At 400 miles per hour, the Lightning's speed advantage was undeniable. While the Zero could still twist and turn at low speed, it could not follow a P-38 in a steep climb. CIS pilot, watching tracers stitch across a Zero's fuselage, later said simply, "For the first time, we had the edge." Here lay the paradox of Guadalcanal. The Japanese, whose doctrine centered on maneuver and courage, suddenly faced an enemy who refused to duel on those terms. Instead of circling in endless spirals, the Americans struck in slashing passes. Their guns, 4 .50 caliber machine guns, and a 20 mm cannon mounted in the nose, delivering concentrated fire in a heartbeat. A single burst could shred fabric and fuel lines that were never armored against such punishment. Statistics gave shape to the fear. The P-38 could climb at nearly 4,750 feet per minute, compared to the Zero's 3,100. Its service ceiling stretched toward 44,000 feet, a realm the Zero could not touch. And perhaps most important, the Lightning could range 1,600 miles with drop tanks, a reach that foreshadowed missions to come. For the Japanese pilots on Guadalcanal, this was not propaganda. It was reality written in altitude charts and wreckage scattered across jungle hillsides. The first battle was not decisive in numbers, but it was decisive in psychology. Saburo Sakai, Japan's most famous surviving ace, would later reflect that the Americans' new machines and tactics made the old way of flying obsolete. Courage remained, but courage alone could no longer close the gap. The contrast was stark. In the humid air of Guadalcanal, Men who had once looked down on Western machines as clumsy suddenly felt hunted. The irony was sharp. Japan had entered the war boasting the most feared fighter in the Pacific, but within a year it was already being eclipsed. The P-38 Lightning did not appear by accident. It was born out of a design philosophy unlike anything the Japanese had expected. When Lockheed engineers sketched its twin-boom silhouette in the late 1930s, many thought it looked alien. But in that alien shape were hidden the secrets that made Japanese pilots feel powerless. At its heart were two Allison V1710 engines, each linked to a turbo supercharger. Most fighters of the day struggled at higher altitudes, their power dropping as the thin air starved carburetors. The P-38's turbos sang a different song, a metallic shriek as compressed air fed the engines. This gave it the strength to climb past 30,000 feet and still accelerate, something the Zero could not dream of. Pilots described the feeling as riding a rocket with wings. Every feature had purpose. The Lightning's concentrated nose armament was no accident. Unlike wing-mounted guns which scattered fire, the P-38's 4.50 caliber Browning machine guns and single 20 mm Hispano cannon were mounted together in the nose. Their tracers converged instantly, not yards away, meaning that even short bursts could cut through thin metal skin. One US ace recalled, "I tapped the trigger, and the Zero simply came apart." The Japanese, accustomed to long duels of maneuver, suddenly found themselves destroyed in seconds. The paradox deepened in the cockpit itself. The Lightning was heavier than the Zero, nearly twice as massive, yet this bulk carried hidden strengths. Armor plate shielded the pilot's back. Self-sealing tanks meant a hit did not guarantee a fiery death. Japanese pilots, trained to fly machines that prized lightness over protection, watched in frustration as American planes took hits and kept flying. One Zero pilot later admitted, "We fired, we struck, but they did not burn." The design also addressed another battlefield truth: distance. The Pacific Ocean was not Europe. Here ranges were immense, and islands stood like stepping stones across thousands of miles. Most fighters of the era could not manage such distances, but the P-38 was built for it. With drop tanks, it could cover 1,600 miles, an unimaginable figure to the Japanese. That reach meant it could escort bombers, stalk enemies far from base, and even perform missions never thought possible for a fighter. There was also the matter of speed. The Lightning could break 400 miles per hour, outpacing the Zero by almost 70. At high altitudes, the gap widened. The service ceiling, 44,000 feet compared to the Zero's 33,000, gave American pilots a permanent throne above their opponents. From there, they could dictate the terms of battle. It was no longer the Japanese who chose where and when to fight. Numbers told the same story. The Zero, stripped for agility, climbed at around 3,100 feet per minute. The Lightning, in contrast, climbed at 4,750. That difference was not academic. This, too, created a cruel irony. Japanese pilots had been taught that honor meant facing the enemy in turning duels, skill against skill. But the Lightning was built for a different kind of war, one where engineering eclipsed tradition. As American pilots quickly learned, they did not need to turn at all. They simply dove, fired, and climbed away. And what came next would prove that design alone could not be dismissed as luck. The Lightning's tactics would rewrite air combat itself. The skies over the Pacific had once been painted with the myth of invincibility. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was light, agile, and feared. Its silhouette meant danger, and for a time, Japanese pilots believed they could not be matched. But when the Lightning arrived, the numbers began to tell a different truth, one written in cold mathematics rather than martial spirit. On paper, the contrasts were stark. The Zero's maximum speed hovered around 332 miles per hour at its best altitude. The P-38, by contrast, could tear past 400 miles per hour in level flight. That 70-mile gap was not just a statistic, it was a gulf of survival. In a chase, the Lightning could always escape. In a dive, the Zero's frame shuddered, its controls locking stiff, while the P-38 grew steadier as it fell, turbochargers howling. Climb rates told the same story. The Zero could claw skyward at 3,100 feet per minute. Impressive for its time, but the P-38 climbed at nearly 4,750 feet per minute, carrying armor, heavier guns, and double the engines. Altitude meant initiative. Whoever held the high ground dictated the fight, and for the first time, that crown no longer belonged to Japan. The ceilings of the two aircraft confirmed the verdict. The Zero topped out at about 33,000 feet. The P-38 reached 44,000. 10,000 feet may sound abstract, but for a pilot straining at the edge of performance, it was the difference between predator and prey. Lightning pilots often began combat by diving down from unreachable heights, unleashing fire and climbing away untouched. Firepower made the disparity brutal. The Zero carried two 7.7 mm machine guns in its nose and two 20 mm cannons in its wings. Deadly against unarmored opponents, yes, but often inaccurate due to wing convergence. The Lightning's armament was concentrated: 4 50 caliber Brownings and a single 20 mm Hispano cannon mounted in the nose. All 5 guns struck in a single stream. It was like a buzzsaw, one American recalled. Even a short burst could rip apart a Zero's fabric-covered wings or ignite its fuel tanks. Protection was the cruelest irony of all. The Zero was built light, without self-sealing tanks, without heavy armor. It was a blade, but a fragile one. Japanese pilots prided themselves on daring. A single hit could still mean victory. Yet against the Lightning, their bullets often failed to cripple. P-38s carried armor plate and self-sealing tanks. They limped home, scarred but alive, while Zeros that caught a burst rarely returned. "We hit them and nothing happened," one Japanese pilot lamented after Guadalcanal. Even range underscored the shift. The Zero had once shocked opponents with its reach, able to travel nearly 1,200 miles, but the Lightning stretched farther still, 1,600 miles with drop tanks. That meant missions deep into enemy territory, interception far from home bases, and strategic strikes the Japanese could scarcely anticipate. The paradox was painful for those who had believed in Japan's technological edge. In 1941, the Zero had been the terror of Pearl Harbor and the Philippines. By late 1942, its weaknesses were exposed. Lightness that once gave unmatched agility became a curse when facing planes that could outrun, outclimb, and outgun it. Numbers, however, never exist in a vacuum. They become flesh and blood when translated into tactics. And it was here that the Lightning's advantages turned into something more than figures on a page. They became a doctrine, one that destroyed the very idea of dogfighting as Japan had known it. But to understand how devastating that doctrine was, one must see how American pilots learned to fly not like knights in a duel, but like hunters with new weapons. In the old style of air combat, battles resembled duels. 2 fighters circled, twisting and turning, each pilot testing nerves and reflexes until one slipped. The Zero had been built for this very dance. Light, nimble, deadly at low speed. But the P-38 Lightning was not designed for duels. It was designed to kill quickly and survive. That single difference ended the age of the dogfight in the Pacific. American pilots soon discovered a paradox that would haunt their opponents. The more they refused to engage in turning battles, the more decisive their victories became. Instead of circling with the Zero, they struck in fast, slashing attacks. They dove from altitude, fired a short burst from the nose guns, and climbed back into the sky before the Japanese could react. This tactic became known as boom and zoom. The sounds of these encounters stayed with the men who lived them. The shriek of turbochargers as P-38s descended like thunderbolts, the sharp bark of Brownings, the sudden silence as Zeros spiraled into the sea. One Japanese survivor remembered the frustration. They would not fight us. They struck and ran. It was not a battle, it was an execution. The Lightning's speed made these tactics possible. At over 400 miles per hour, it could leave pursuit behind. Its climb rate, 4,750 feet per minute meant a vertical escape that the Zero's 3,100 could never match. American pilots quickly realized they could choose when to fight and when to vanish. It was the first time in the war that they held such control. Armament played its part. In a turning duel, scattered wing guns might slowly chip away at an enemy, but the Lightning's nose-mounted weapons concentrated all fire in one line. A high-side pass, diving from above at an angle, unleashed a stream of bullets and cannon shells that cut Zeros apart in a heartbeat. Major Richard Bong, America's top ace with 40 victories, once described the satisfaction: "You lined them up, pressed the trigger, and there was nothing left but wreckage." For Japanese pilots, this was more than a tactical problem. It was an assault on their very identity. They had been trained in the creed of honor, where skill in a duel proved worth, but the Lightning's tactics denied them that chance. It turned combat into mathematics: speed plus altitude plus firepower. Bravery could not bridge the equation. The paradox grew darker. What Japanese pilots saw as dishonorable hit and run, Americans saw as survival. After the heavy losses of 1941 and early 1942, US commanders knew they could not trade one for one with Japan's seasoned aces. They needed efficiency. The P-38 gave it to them. With each slashing attack, more Zeros fell, and fewer Americans died. It wasn't about glory, one pilot admitted. It was about staying alive. The shift was not immediate. Some American pilots, raised on the romance of dueling, tried to outturn Zeros and paid the price. But the lessons spread quickly. By mid-1943, the doctrine was clear: never fight the Zero on its terms. Use altitude, use speed, use the Lightning's strengths. The results were undeniable. Over the course of the war, P-38 Dines destroyed an estimated 1,800 Japanese aircraft across the Pacific. More than 10,000 Lightnings rolled off assembly lines, each one a machine built not for chivalry but for cold efficiency. But tactics alone did not tell the full story. The P-38's reach was as important as its speed. Its long range allowed missions that were once thought impossible, including a daring plan in April 1943. When Lightning pilots were tasked with intercepting the most famous commander in the Japanese Navy. That mission would prove that the P-38 was not only rewriting air combat, it was reshaping the very course of the war. April 18, 1943. The Solomon Islands shimmered in tropical heat, the air heavy with salt and the smell of jungle rot. Beneath the surface of ordinary patrols, a secret mission was unfolding. 16 P-38 Lightnings lifted off from Guadalcanal, each engine thundering with purpose. Their target was not just an enemy aircraft. It was a man, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the symbol of Japan's naval power. The paradox was chilling. Yamamoto had preached caution about awakening America's industrial might. Now, America's industry had built the very machines sent to hunt him. The Lightning, with its unmatched range, was the only fighter capable of flying nearly 1,000 miles round trip to intercept him. No other plane in the American arsenal could have managed it. The P-38's long legs turned what should have been an untouchable inspection flight into a death sentence. The mission was planned with mathematical precision. Intelligence broke the Japanese naval code, revealing Yamamoto's exact route and time. P-38 pilots would fly low, skimming the waves at barely 50 feet to avoid radar, then climb at the perfect moment to intercept his transport near Bougainville. Major John W. Mitchell led the flight, his voice steady as he briefed the men. "We're going after a man who started this war." Hours of tense silence filled the cockpits, the smell of oil mixed with the tang of salt spray as they raced just above the ocean. Every pilot knew fuel was tight. There was no room for error. The Lightning's twin tails cast shadows across the waves, like hunters gliding silently toward their prey. At exactly the predicted time, the enemy appeared. Two Mitsubishi Gay 4M Betty bombers, flanked by 6-0 escorts, shimmered against the sun. One carried Yamamoto. The trap was sprung. The P-38 roared upward, turbochargers screaming as they climbed from sea level into combat altitude. The fight was brutal and short. Lightning guns tore into the lumbering bombers. One Betty exploded in flame. The other staggered into the jungle. Admiral Yamamoto was dead before he could even unbuckle his harness. A Japanese officer who later inspected the wreck wrote simply, "The admiral lay as if asleep, but his war had ended." The numbers were stark. 16 American fighters had flown over 400 miles one way, struck precisely, and returned. They had destroyed Japan's greatest strategist at a cost of just one lightning lost. It was not luck. It was range, firepower, and planning, the very qualities baked into the P-38's design. For Japanese pilots, the mission was a nightmare made real. The skies that had once felt secure were no longer safe. The very idea that the enemy could strike with such reach shocked them. If Yamamoto, guarded by fighters deep in Japanese territory, could be killed, then no one was beyond America's grasp. The paradox deepened. Japan had entered the war believing in spirit over machinery, but here was proof that machinery, backed by intelligence and industry, could reach across oceans to kill even the most protected man. The myth of invulnerability was shattered. American pilots remembered the mission with pride, but also with awe. One recalled the eerie silence after Yamamoto Sepp's death, broken only by the engines droning them home. It felt like history itself was in our hands. Operation Vengeance proved more than a tactical victory. It was a symbol. The P-38 was not just a fighter, it was a strategic weapon. Its speed, range, and concentrated firepower allowed it to shape the war at the highest level. The roar of a single P-38 engine was frightening enough, but the roar of thousands, built month after month in American factories, became unstoppable. If Guadalcanal and Bougainville showed what the Lightning could do, America's industry showed why it could keep doing it. Endlessly. This was the paradox that crushed Japan, no matter how bravely their pilots fought. The sky itself was filling with machines they could never match in number. Lockheed, pressed into overdrive by the US war effort, produced more than 10,000 P-38 by the end of the war. Each one rolled off the line with the same twin tails, the same turbocharged engines, the same promise of speed and reach. Factories worked day and night, the clang of tools and the hiss of welding torches blending into a music of industry. Rosie the Riveter, sleeves rolled up, riveted metal skin onto wings that would soon carry young men into combat half a world away. The contrast was painful for Japan. Their aircraft industry, strained by shortages of aluminum, fuel, and skilled labor, could not keep pace. In 1942, Japan could still replace its losses. By 1944, every zero lost was a wound that would not heal. Statistics told the story. The United States produced nearly 100,000 aircraft in 1944 alone. Japan produced barely a fraction of that, often under constant bombing. This was not propaganda. It was reality measured in production logs. Training widened the gap even further. Early in the war, Japanese pilots were the most skilled in the Pacific, veterans of China and Pearl Harbor. Their training programs were long and brutal, producing elite flyers like Saburo Sakai, but those programs took years. When the veterans were lost, replacements could not be trained fast enough. By 1944, Japanese rookies were being rushed into combat with as little as 100 flying hours. In contrast, America refined its training pipeline. Hundreds of new pilots were trained every month, flying advanced trainers, then combat aircraft, with a focus on teamwork and survival. The P-38 itself was forgiving to learn, rugged enough to take damage, and stable for young pilots to handle. Major Thomas Maguire, who scored 38 victories, once said, "The Lightning could take you home, even when you thought you were finished." That reliability meant fewer losses to accidents and more experience kept in the air. Logistics played their part. The P-38's engines were complex, but American mechanics had access to parts, manuals, and a supply chain that stretched from California to the jungles of New Guinea. Ground crews worked in heat and mud, the smell of oil and sweat clinging to uniforms, but they kept the Lightnings flying. Japanese mechanics, by contrast, often had to cannibalize wrecks for parts. As the war dragged on, Zeros waited grounded while P-38s roared skyward in waves. The paradox was bitter. Japanese pilots often claimed courage was their edge, yet courage could not refill fuel tanks or build new planes. Every time a Zero was lost, it took with it not only a machine but an irreplaceable veteran. Every time a P-38 was lost, a replacement waited on the docks and another pilot stepped forward to fly it. And numbers mattered. By the end of the war, P-38s were credited with destroying around 1,800 Japanese aircraft in the Pacific. It was not just the skill of individual aces like Richard Bong or Maguire, but the collective weight of a system that produced, supplied, and sustained them. The war in the air was no longer about who could turn tighter in a duel. It was about who could stay in the fight longest. America's factories, training schools, and logistics lines ensured that the Lightning always returned. Japan's shrinking resources ensured that the Zero faded away. But within these numbers were human stories, voices of pilots who lived the paradox firsthand, both Japanese and American. Their diaries and memories would capture the shock, the pride, and the sorrow of meeting in the skies over the Pacific. History is often written in numbers, ranges, speeds, production totals, but it is lived in human voices. The clash between the P-38 Lightning and the Japanese Zero was not only a contest of machines, it was a struggle carried in the hearts of men strapped into cramped cockpits with sweat on their brows and death pressing close. Their words remind us of the paradox at the center of the story, courage and skill on both sides, yet only one could endure when matched against relentless technology and industry. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most celebrated aces with 64 claimed victories, recalled his shock after meeting the Lightning for the first time. They were fast, too fast. We could not close the distance. When they fired, it was like being struck by a hammer. Our bullets seemed useless. His tone was not one of cowardice, but of frustration. A veteran realizing that his training and instincts had met a wall he could not climb. American pilots, too, carried the memory of paradox. They had once feared the Zero's agility, warned never to try to outturn it. Yet with the Lightning, the tables had turned. Major Richard Bong, who scored 40 victories, described the satisfaction and unease of his success. The P-38 gave us the advantage we needed. You lined up the nose, fired, and the fight was over. It felt unfair, but war is not fair. The sounds and sensations of combat never left them. The smell of cordite filled cockpits after bursts of fire. The metallic shriek of turbochargers was the soundtrack to every climb. Gunfire rattled airframes, and the sudden silence of an enemy engine cutting out was often followed by the terrible sight of a Zero falling in flames. Pilots on both sides wrote of those moments in diaries later found in footlockers or collected after the war. Even American aces acknowledged respect for their opponents. Major Thomas Maguire, with 38 victories, once said, "The Japanese pilots were fearless. They came at us with everything they had. But bravery alone cannot stop bullets." That was the cruel truth of the Pacific Air War. One side relied on spirit and skill, the other on technology and supply, and technology, multiplied by production, won the contest. For Japanese flyers, the shock was personal. Many had believed the Zero represented not just a weapon but the spirit of the nation. To see it outclassed was to feel their own world cracking. One pilot wrote, "We could not understand how they always climbed higher. We chased and chased, but the Lightning vanished into the clouds. It was like chasing a ghost." The paradox repeated endlessly. Americans felt relief that their machines finally gave them survival odds. Japanese pilots felt despair that their courage no longer changed the outcome. Each encounter in the sky became a mirror, reflecting two truths: the Lightning's power and the Zero's decline. And yet, behind these voices, the war pressed on with unrelenting weight. The Lightning became not just a fighter but a symbol of America's ability to turn steel, fuel, and training into dominance. The Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, became a relic of an earlier moment when agility could win battles. These personal stories, soaked in sweat and oil, lead us to the final paradox of the war. The men who began as conquerors left the skies as students of a new reality. one where courage mattered, but technology and supply decided who lived to see another dawn. That truth brings us to the aftermath, where the legacy of the Lightning stretched beyond the war itself, shaping not only victory but the memory of what air combat had become. By the summer of 1945, the Pacific sky no longer belonged to Japan. The proud Zero, once hailed as the terror of the oceans, had become a shadow of its former self. Its light frame and fearless pilots could not resist the relentless tide of American machines. The P-38 Lightning, with its twin tails and thunderous engines, stood as a symbol of this shift, a paradox made real. The hunter had become the hunted, and those who once believed they ruled the sky now looked upward with fear. The statistics were merciless. More than 10,000 P-38s rolled out of American factories, each carrying the same reach, power, and resilience. They claimed around 1,800 Japanese aircraft destroyed across the Pacific. In contrast, Japan's resources dwindled. Oil ran scarce, aluminum grew precious, and veteran pilots became irreplaceable. By 1944, green recruits with barely 100 flight hours climbed into cockpits where seasoned aces had once sat. They faced not only the Lightning but also an enemy that had become an industrial giant. The paradox was clear in every engagement. Japanese pilots flew with the same courage they had shown since Pearl Harbor, but courage could not make a Zero climb faster, fly farther, or absorb bullets. American flyers, many still barely older than 20, now fought with the assurance that their machines could carry them home. As one Lightning pilot recalled, "You trusted her. She took hits, she rattled, but she brought you back." The sensory contrast remained etched in memory. For the Japanese, the scream of a turbocharged dive became a harbinger of doom. For the Americans, the sight of a Zero igniting after a concentrated burst was both triumph and tragedy. Diaries and memoirs capture these details. The acrid sting of cordite in the nose, the rough vibration of guns firing in unison, the sudden silence when an enemy's engine went dead, war reduced to moments of sound and smell, fleeting yet eternal. Voices from both sides carry the same melancholy. Saburo Sakai admitted late in life that the Zero could not keep up. It was like facing the future, and we were in the past. On the other side, Major Richard Bong reflected on the edge his Lightning gave him, but added softly, "They fought as bravely as anyone could, but bravery isn't enough when machines make the difference." And so the larger legacy emerged. The P-38 Lightning was not merely an aircraft. It was proof that modern war was no longer won by spirit alone. It was won by industry, by design, by supply chains that stretched across oceans. Japan's faith in tradition met America's arsenal of democracy, and tradition broke under the weight. They had come as conquerors. They left as students. The Zero, once untouchable, was eclipsed by an enemy it could neither catch nor resist. The Lightning's legacy lived on in jet-age designs, in the very idea that altitude, speed, and firepower, multiplied by production, define victory. In the end, America's greatest weapon was not only the bombs it dropped or the guns it fired, it was its abundance of machines, of fuel, of pilots trained and ready. The P-38 Lightning embodied that abundance, and it taught the Pacific skies a lesson written in contrails and wreckage, that the age of the warrior's duel was over, and the age of industrial air power had begun. The story of the P-38 Lightning and the Japanese Zero is not only about aircraft, it is about the clash between tradition and modernity, between courage and technology, between scarcity and abundance. On one side stood men who had once ruled the sky, flying machines built light and fast but fragile. On the other stood a nation that poured steel, fuel, and human effort into building machines that could not only fight but endure. The paradox at the heart of the story is that both sides fought with equal valor. Japanese pilots hurled themselves into battle with unmatched bravery. American pilots, many young and untested, found in their Lightnings the power to survive and prevail. The outcome was not decided by who cared more, but by who could sustain the fight. Voices from the war remind us that behind the numbers were human lives, Saburo Sakai's lament of facing the future captures the despair of seeing an old way vanish. Richard Bong's quiet acknowledgement that bravery wasn't enough speaks to the sober reality of modern combat. Together they form a chorus of men caught in a transformation larger than themselves. The legacy endures. The P-38 Lightning taught the world that air power was no longer about the nimble duel, but about reach, speed, firepower, and the weight of supply. It changed not only the outcome of the Pacific War, but also the very shape of air combat in the modern age. In the end, the Lightning was more than a fighter. It was a message written in steel, that in the clash between past and future, the future always climbs higher.